So we just opened the lid of this hive, and what we're looking at is how it's going. It's just before spring here, and it's looking quite healthy at the moment. We've got a lot of bees here. It's looking like it's ready to super. And you can see by the way they're building up this beautiful wax under the lid that they're really looking for some more room to store their honey. So that's a great time to then be putting on your brood box. You can also see some nectar glistening down inside some of these cells they're building, showing that they are bringing in fresh nectar. A couple of little hive beetles running around. Sorry about that little beetle. But a colony like this, the hive beetles won't worry because there's so many bees to police them. So what we're going to do is pull out a few frames and just have a look, make sure there's no pests or disease. We also may cycle out a couple of frames and open up the brood nest, giving more space for laying. We'll just have a look at that. Of course, those decisions need to be made depending on whether you've got forage coming in, whether you've got a lot of nectar coming in. You don't want to starve your bees either if there isn't much coming in. So we're just going to have a look. If you've got questions, put them in the comments below and we'll answer them as we go. First of all, I've just opened this inner cover and it was sitting directly on top of the brood box, which means the queen could be on here, and sometimes she is. So cast your eye over, have a look around. You're looking for that movement, you're looking for that shiny back plate, not to be confused with drones like this one here. You can see just where my hive tool is, there's a big drone. They're a more plumper, round shape with big eyes, whereas the queen is longer with a long abdomen but otherwise has a head similar to the worker. So we're looking for that motion that's often associated, that striding, strutting motion, and a bit of a clearing around the queen. Can't see her, so what I'm going to do is put this right at the entrance just in case I have missed the queen, so that she is on there, she can crawl straight back into the entrance and become part of the hive again. Okay, I'll just lean that there. Next, what we're going to do is get our smoker going just by giving it a few good puffs, and then we're going to use it to clear some bees away where we might choose to start working. Sometimes it's easier to get one of the central frames out because they tend to start bulging the frames on the edges with honey, and in the centre they're usually a bit thinner, so there's less issues with lifting them up. Once you've got the first frame out, of course, it's a lot easier. Notice the way the bees really cleared away from the smoke, so that's a good trick so you don't harm bees as you're working. Now what I'm doing is just cutting away some of that burr comb. Now because I'm lifting this frame, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it on this side so that that wax can lift with the frame and therefore not drag along the comb surface, because we don't want to damage the comb surface, especially if it's got brood in it. Okay, now that should be free to lift. The next thing I need to do is get my hive tool, the chisel end here, and just lever between the end bars. You see that little gap there between the frames? Putting the chisel in, levering across just to loosen that up, so it'll be much easier to lift it up. Okay. Okay, that should come up now. Setting a little bit more smoke. If you've got a lot of bees down between the frames, sometimes you can roll them as you lift it up. This hook end goes under the end bar. This is the tool that comes with our bee suit kits. Okay, so I'm just lifting that up like that. I'm going to grab it with my hand and then go to the other end. Out of the way, little beezy. If you've got questions, put them in the comments below and we'll answer them. There's no such thing as a silly question. so please ask away. So we're just gently lifting up. It's that first frame that is the hardest. And what I'm seeing as I lift is we have worker brood and drone brood on this frame. So I'll just point out the difference to you here. This is the worker brood and this is the drone brood. Notice the drone brood sticks out further from the comb surface and looks like little rounded mountains, whereas the worker brood is more of a flat surface, which is closer to honeycomb but not quite as transparent as a honeycomb capping is. We're also seeing nectar here, showing that they are bringing nectar in, which is fantastic. I've just got the very start of spring here, a little bit later than last year. I was expecting the nectar to be pouring in by now, but it is weather dependent. And it's gotten quite dry now, which I think has slowed things down a little bit. And this is the honey up here. Any questions? Put them in the comments below. So what we're going to do is just check that this hive is happy and healthy and prepare it for adding a super next week. The super is the term for your honey box. So in our case, it's a flow super with flow frames in it to store honey for easy honey harvesting.
Charlie has a question. Do you clean up all the burr comb or just leave it? Do you scrape the ends of the frame so that they sit back together?
So it depends a little bit on your strategy. So there are some natural beekeepers who like to leave any burr comb around, saying it's a reservoir for the bees. It's a storage for the bees if they need to use that wax or propolis. Most beekeepers like to keep it clean just for the ease of lifting frames out. So I'll scrape it away a bit. I'll take advantage while there's not many bees there, just to remove that wax. Now, if you're removing wax and it's got honey on it, it's really important not to leave it outside the hive, or you'll promote robbing as bees start collecting honey rather than nectar, and also spread any pathogens from this hive to the hives that will come and feed on that. So you want to place that somewhere and take that away at the end of your inspection, or you could throw it into the hive and the bees will deal with it. So what I'm going to do now is just put this frame, I can't see the queen here, taking a bit of a glance. It's not necessary to find the queen because I can see there's plenty of young bees getting laid. If you have a look down some cells here, just where my thumb is, you might even see the grubs. So just clear some bees away. Can you see the grubs in the bottom of the cells? That's the baby bee larvae. They spend about 11 days in that grub phase and then 11 days in the cocoon phase before hatching as a baby bee, and it's amazing to watch that process. You'll often get to see a bee hatching out because there's quite a big turnover. A hive might have 1,000 baby bees hatching every day. Okay, so we're just going to rest that here. I've used a couple of shelf brackets to make a nice little frame rest. There we go. You can support 3 frames on that, which is plenty because that just makes enough space for you to move the other frames around. So we're going to keep going and have a look at this next frame. Now the next one's easier to move because you can just move it straight across and up, and there's none of that having to cut away the burr comb in order to lift it. If you've got questions, you can put them in the comments. But we're basically just having a look at this hive in lieu of adding a super next week because there's plenty of bees in it. It looks nice and healthy, and we should find that it will populate that super quite quickly as the bees start to really build up in the springtime. So I'm just looking at this, and this is all honey except for one small patch of drone brood here. You can see that drone brood, and there's a drone right on my hive tool. See how they're bigger? They've got the bigger eyes that touch in the middle. And there's the drone brood. So if that was all honey, you could just take that away and enjoy eating that, if there was enough nectar around for the bees to keep foraging on and keep their supplies up. So I'm going to have another quick look for the queen on that frame, and then put it aside. Get the sun on it just for the shot. Okay, if anyone spots the queen, do tell me. It's a fun game, queen spotting. Any questions? Put them in the comments. Okay, I'm just going to rest that one aside too, making plenty of space for us to work now. So the next frame is all honey. I can see just by looking down here, the next frame is all honey. So we might choose to take a frame or two away and really open up that brood nest for spring. And that limits the swarming. One of the triggers for swarming is not enough space to lay brood, as well as being quite crowded with bees. So let's just go through and look at the next frame.
Cedar, I have a question. How do you manage crosscomb?
So managing crosscomb is something you may need to do if you're using naturally drawn frames like this. So this is the kind I like to use. There's just a small strip up here which just gives the bees a guide to start building on. But when they start building, you can't guarantee they're going to build in a nice straight line. We put this here because we give them a guide to start, but they may go a bit wonky and they may even go completely sideways. So managing crosscomb is something you need to do if you're putting a lot of these frames into a box at once, and you just need to check it often as they get started and make sure they're going straight. If they're going wonky, you need to get out your tool and bend them back in line. If you've left it too late and it's all really crosscomb, then you'll need to actually go through an exercise of taking out the comb and rubber banding or using some skewers through these side points to get it back in line. I've actually never had to do it. It's never gotten that bad. I've always been able to either remove the frame altogether and eat it as honeycomb, start another one, or just bend it back into line and keep the bees going. So it's all about catching it early, the crosscomb, but once they've built in nice straight lines like this hive has, then they're away and they'll stay straight, because if you add a comb in between two straight ones, then they'll use the others as a guide to draw that comb nice and straight and eventually connect it to the edges, and then you've got a nice naturally drawn comb with no wires in it, no foundation. And if you want to chop that out for honeycomb, then you can easily. If you want to take an old frame out of the hive, you can even just cut it out right here in the field, chuck it on a tray and put the frame straight back in. It saves having a workshop full of messy old frames getting eaten by wax moth and things that beekeepers usually have. Like I have had lots in the past, so I like the tactics of naturally drawn combs.
Ian has a question. Do bees breed as much in winter as in summer?
No, so bees will throttle their egg laying to how much nectar and pollen is available. So that's what you want to happen, because you don't want to get in a situation where the bees have got a lot of bees but no forage, and then they're getting hungry and eating all the stores really quickly. So you want the hive to be adjusting to what's around. So what happens over winter when there's not as many flowers, here we still get some flowers, in some places they get none, then the colony shrinks down just to survive those times when there's not much nectar, and then as soon as the nectar flow starts again, they will start laying. So they're very clever, they're amazing, and they just work it out. The nectar's coming in, they go, all right, time to start laying, and then what happens is you get this massive burst in bee numbers as the spring comes, and your bees are bulging out the front, and they're ready to split or split themselves and do a swarm. So that's a time when you can take splits and start new colonies.
Brian would like to know, will the bees fill that drone brood with honey after they hatch?
Yes, so bees will use cells for anything. They will repurpose brood cells for honey. They love using drone-sized cells for honey because it stores more honey. And you'll often find them making drone-sized cells in your top box, and that's why we made the flow frames a bit bigger than brood cells, because we wanted the queen not to choose to lay in it if she has a choice. Doesn't always work, but in some hives you can run with no excluder due to the cell size.
Barbara asks, my hive is coming up to the 2nd year running. Should I be swapping out some frames?
So generally beekeepers after a couple of years like to start rotating out the brood frames when they get all dark and old like this one is. Notice how it's kind of dark and old. So it's said to have more of a pathogen load when it gets like that, and it's a good idea to start cycling them out. There's a beautiful waggle dance happening here. Look at this. If you have a look at this bee here, it's got pollen on its legs. It's waggling around, shaking its bottom there. And if you watch, you can actually decode the dance and know which way the bees are flying and how far. So they're flying a fair way. Looking at that waggle, it's waggling for it's about 1 second a kilometre. So that's, wow. They're flying like about 4 kilometres. It's an amazing thing that they have a language in the dark, inside a hive. They can actually give accurate information to the rest of the bees. And if other bees go there and find that the nectar source has finished, they'll actually come back and jump on that bee doing that dance and physically hold it down from telling the story of where the flowers are. So what I'm doing is I'm just having a look at the brood pattern. There's quite a lot of drones in here showing that they're gearing up for the swarm season. Lots and lots of drones hatching, and they'll be taking off soon and congregating in areas waiting for a queen to fly past. So your queen doesn't mate with its own hive, it mates from drones from a lot of hives.
Wesley would like to know, have you ever seen the bees not accept the queen?
Yes, there's actually, it's said something like a third of the time if you put in a new queen, it won't be accepted and will be killed by the bees. So people argue about that hit rate, but it is somewhere around there. You won't get 100% success of acceptance of a new queen. It also depends on what stage the hive is at. If it's hopelessly queenless, been queenless a while, it gets harder and harder to actually get the hive to take a queen.
Jacqueline asks, my flow is ready, waiting for my nuke in October. How long, as a rough guide, until they start using the super?
That depends on the nectar flow and the health of your colony. So the fastest I've seen it is probably a 2 weeks from installing bees to harvest. But that's in a very extreme situation where your colony is rearing and ready to go, and the flowers are dripping to the ground, heavy with nectar. Now, if you are in a situation where there's not much of a nectar flow, or your colony isn't very strong yet, it'll take months and months, and sometimes you won't even get a harvest that season. So it's such a variable. It's always good to have a couple of hives in case one's a bit weak and another one might do well, and that way you can more likely to get a beautiful harvest. It is a case of lots of bees and a good nectar flow in order to really store lots of honey. Typically, you'll be, if you get them going in early spring, you will hopefully be harvesting your first honey in the summertime. It's a beautiful thing just to watch and learn. If you don't learn something new every time you look in a hive, you're probably not looking hard enough. The drones are amazing. Their stripes are different. And that bee is still wandering around doing its dance. How do the other bees know? How do the other bees know from that one dance where the flowers are? It really is something to marvel about. Okay, let's move on to another frame and see what's going on the next one. I'll just add a little bit of smoke right where the end bars are, just so I don't squash so many bees getting that frame out.
Peter says, "Hi Cedar, what's your preferred method of doing a split?"
Hi Peter. So my it depends. If queens are available and you've got some nice genetics and you've ordered hopefully hygienic queens that are nice and gentle would be the ideal situation, and you can order them, take a split, and in that case you will need to find the queen to know you've got a split without a queen, basically taking frames out of here into another box, making sure the queen's left behind, and then inserting your new queen into that new box a day later. That's probably my preferred method, but I did take a lot of splits, just letting them raise their queen naturally as well. More hit and miss. You could get aggressive genetics. They could mate with any old rowdy drones from the neighbourhood. So yeah, my preferred method would be to order some nice queens off a queen breeder.
Jason says, "If I have only one hive and do a walkaway split, will drones from other hives be able to mate with her?"
Absolutely. So there will be bees in your area, no doubt, and it's amazing how they find each other. But typically a drone congregation area will be somewhere like a football field, or they'd like a sort of a lower down point at the bottom of a valley where but a bit circular, so they can fly around, and the queen will look for that same kind of place, and when she gets within cooee, she will mate with up to 15 or more drones on that first mating flight. She may mate once more, and then that'll be it for her up to 6 years of laying sometimes a couple of thousand eggs a day, which is amazing. I think that just the queen can last so long compared to a worker who might only be living 4 to 6 weeks in the foraging season. So the answer is yes, you will find your hive will successfully mate with other drones, unless you're on an island somewhere where there is no other beehive.
Jeff asks, what would be the reason to do a split?
So the reason to do a split is twofold. One is to make some room in your box so they don't naturally split themselves, which is called a swarm. If they swarm, you'll lose a whole bunch of your bees, and that'll slow down production. If you're able to catch that swarm, then it's fine. You can then have another hive by catching that swarm. We've got plenty of videos showing you how to do that. But if you can get ahead of the curve and take a split before they swarm, then you're guaranteed not to lose those bees. So you take a split to start another hive. If you don't want one, somebody else surely will. There's lots of people. There's always a high demand for splits. You can even sell them for good money. So just looking around on this frame, we've got brood again, lots of young larvae down the cells. So this hive is going to do well. It's not totally chockers with brood yet, so we're still probably 3 or 4 weeks away from really exploding with numbers, but I can see it's going to happen by how many young larvae are down in the bottom of these cells here.
Brian asks, is it necessary to clean the flow super between seasons, and if so, how?
So if the flow super stays on the hive, it's not necessary to clean it. The bees do a great job of that, except for perhaps the trough area. If the trough area has been left unkept and the leak back point hasn't been maintained clear, then some honey could build up in there and either go candied or sometimes ferment if you're in a subtropical area. So you may need to clean that just by putting a rag on your flow key and poking it down there, giving it a good clean out. But the flow frames themselves shouldn't need cleaning unless you've taken them off the hive, left them around and they've gotten all grimy and grungy, in which case you could clean them with some hot water. And then put them back in the hive, and the bees will do a far better job of cleaning them than you can.
Joshua asks, do farmers ever use your bees to help pollinate their plants or crops?
They do. So my friend Mason's down here. He's got a few hundred acres of macadamias in the valley down here below, and beekeepers will come and drop off several hundred hives during the flowering season. So certainly bees are used for pollination, and you can do the same thing if you like. Let's say you don't have anywhere to put your hive, or you really want a hive but you don't have anywhere to put it. Somebody else will surely like it on their place in order to do its beautiful thing of pollination, and usually it'll just cost you a few jars of honey.
Siobhan asks, what is the lifespan of a drone, and is their only job to mate with the queen?
So drones typically live for around 6 months, and it is said that their only job is to mate with the queen, but we're finding more and more out about bee colonies all the time. They are an extremely studied insect and extremely fascinating, so I wouldn't be surprised if there is more functions that we don't know about yet. But basically they don't do any chores around the hive, from what we can tell. They don't clean the cells, they don't take away the dead, they don't build any wax, and they don't feed any brood. What they do is just hang around waiting to be fed by the worker bees, and then they will take off and fly to a drone congregation area hoping to mate with a queen. So beekeepers in the past have actually decided that drones are detrimental because they just eat honey, and they start cutting away the drone cells or putting in foundation which doesn't have any drone sized cells on it, trying to limit the numbers of drones. Now, since then people's minds have changed, recognising that it's probably better to let the hive decide whether to make drones or not. If your whole hive turns into all drones, then that's another issue where the queen has actually run out of sperm and can only lay drones, or you've lost your queen altogether, and the workers are starting to lay. Because they're unfertilised eggs, they will only be able to lay drones. Except on a rare freak occasion of immaculate conception, where a worker bee can actually lay a female a clone of itself, which can then be turned into a queen.
Liz says, my bees haven't built out their outside frames but have fully capped honey frames either side of the brood. Should I move the honey frames to the outside yet? I'm just outside of Sydney, still cold in the morning.
That's a choice that's up to you. You can, if you want to play around, you could move the honey frames out and put some fresh frames in, or save the bees moving it. If you're still getting cold nights, you might just want to leave the brood nest together though, so that's the balance. Either way will be fine actually. If you want to move them out, you can do that, but if you want to leave the brood nest together, the bees will eat away that honey, making room, and they'll shift it as they go. They're very, very good at that.
Wesley says, in my area the bees seem to be disappearing at an alarming rate. What can we do to be bee friendly?
Okay, it is a sad state of affairs when bees are unable to prosper in an area, and there are parts of the world where bees cannot even survive, and you've lost all of the pollinating insects and all the species, and people are hand pollinating with feathers and jars of pollen that's been hand collected. So we cannot let that happen to our world, and we do need to look after our bees, which means stopping spraying insecticides on flowers, which means creating habitat, which means leaving wild spaces for even the weeds to flower, which means planting flowering species in your yard for not only the honeybees but all of the native and often solitary bees that get around in the garden. And what you're doing is you're creating stepping stones for some species that are on the brink of extinction, allowing them to expand their reach and multiply. So really important that we recognise that some countries are having 90% insect loss and start to change our ways. Humans have modified almost every surface of our planet. We need to reverse that effect. We need to re-wild our world, to create wild spaces and really make sure that the myriad of life that we all completely depend on is able to prosper.
Jason asks, do you raise your own queens? If so, what is your preference to raise them?
So I don't do queen raising, but it would be a fun thing to get into, and you can buy kits online, and there's a lot of information on how to easily start raising your queens. But it's not something I have got into as yet. There's always so much more to learn and so much more to do in beekeeping.
Scott would like to know, do colonies last forever or do they need to be replaced?
So they replace themselves is the answer, except for sometimes they don't, in which case they die out if you don't get to them and fix that. I'm just going to top up this little smoker. So if the hive's got a failing queen, most of the time they will create a new one and actually kill the old queen. So another thing that happens too is your colony will change genetics by a swarm. So if your colony builds up and it's half the bees have left, they'll actually take the old queen and your hive will get the new one that they've raised. Completely different set of genetics, and that's when you can get a change in temperament of your hive, as there's new genetics from the drones from all sorts of other hives coming back into your hive. And it could go either way. You could get a more gentle hive or you could get a more aggressive hive, but hopefully it's a nice productive one.
Rachel asks, your bees are so lovely and quiet. My bees go wild when I do my inspection. Should I consider requeening?
It is a pleasure to have a gentle hive. As you can see, I could probably do this without my bee suit on, and sometimes we do. But it's really a call that's up to you. If you've got a good functioning hive and it's producing a lot of nice honey, then it feels a shame to then go and squash the queen and introduce a new one to get those new genetics. But if it's important to you and your hive is starting to get aggressive, or perhaps you've got neighbours or children around, or and there's a reason to have a nice gentle hive, then you can get in there and make that change. Order a nice, quiet, already mated queen from a queen breeder and change it over, which will involve finding your queen, taking her away and putting in a new one, usually a day later.
Sherry would like to know, do you recommend taking flow frame off when we have sub-zero weather in the winter? From Wyoming, USA.
It's a bit of a question. A lot of people with long cold winters will take the supers off, no matter what type of beekeeping. They reduce their hive down to a smaller one. If you haven't got many boxes and the bees need the forage, you might choose to let the bees eat the honey out of the flow super. But what you should do is remove the queen excluder so that the bees can move freely around the hive and eat the honey and not leave the queen behind underneath the excluder as the ball of bees moves up into your flow super.
Jeff would like to know, when is the best time to split a hive, and where does the queen come from to start another colony?
So you can either buy in a queen from a queen breeder, which comes in a little cage typically with about 5 escort bees, and it's amazing. They actually just arrive in the mail, so you can order a bunch of queens in the mail. They come in these little cages, and you can then take a split from a hive without a queen and then put your queen bee into that new box, and she will then emerge from that little cage after the candy gets eaten away, and away they go. Or you can take some of the frames out of here, put them into another box, and as long as you've got eggs or larvae under 3 days old, so you're looking down the cells for that tiny little grain of rice, then the bees will actually turn one of those cells into a queen cell and raise their own queen. If you order a queen in, you'll be about a month ahead of the curve by the time the bees have to raise their own queen and go on a mating flight, wait for good weather to do the mating and so on. So that's another advantage of ordering in a queen, is you'll get a leapfrog and catch more of the season.
Rhonda would like to know, when is the best time of the year to start a hive? We live in central Louisiana.
So the best time is when there's lots of forage around. In most areas that's going to be in your spring and early summer. However, if you're here, then you can almost start a hive any time, simply because we do get flowers through the winter. Usually, this winter's been a little bit poor, but most of the time we get flowers during the winter time, and we can actually take splits in the middle of our winter. But if you're in your area, you wouldn't be doing that. So the best time to start your colony is the springtime. The second best time would be in the early summer.
Wesley would like to know, what is your opinion on frameless hives?
So I imagine you're talking about top bars, where you've just got sticks of wood that the bees draw their natural comb from, and they don't actually have any frames. It's also called a Kenyan Hive. It was developed for third world country beekeeping, where they didn't really have many resources, and it works quite well. There's a lot of people that do it. It basically involves shaping a long sort of coffin-shaped hive with sloping walls, so you're mimicking the kind of shape of the honeycomb, and they're less likely then to attach the comb to the walls. Some of our staff here keep top bar hives at home, and I haven't got any at the moment. The disadvantages of it are you will need to get in there to harvest your honey, and you will need to often chop away the comb that's connected to other frames and to the edges of the hive. You then take the honeycomb out and either just eat it for honeycomb, or buy a press and press the wax and basically squeeze out the honeycomb, or you can do it with your hands, just kind of squeezing the honeycomb over a bucket. So my opinion is I love the flow hive because you can harvest honey at the turn of a handle while the bees are just going about their business, and I find that a beautiful and rewarding experience to have and share with people, as you can sit around the back of the hive and often just harvest honey without the bees even noticing you're doing it. Okay, we'll lift one more frame out. Okay, are we going to find a queen on this frame? You can see plenty of waggle dances on. There's a lot of communication going on in this hive. The bees are getting a bit excited about the springtime. They're raising drones. I'm just having a good look at the cells, checking for any dark sunken capping, making sure, keeping an eye out for AFB or EFB, which are the worst brood diseases you can get.
Jeff says, I live in the northern part of the USA and we sometimes get temperatures below 0 Fahrenheit. I'm not sure how to stop my hive from freezing. If I insulate the hive and make sure they have sugar water, is it possible for them to survive the winter?
The answer is yes, and there's different theories on insulation. Some say that you don't need to insulate, you just need to protect your hive from the wind. So if you've got a screen bottom board, make sure the ventilation is closed. And the bees will keep themselves warm by huddling in a ball. And they certainly do. You find beekeepers just with wooden boxes like this digging their hives out of the snow up in Nebraska, and the bees are fine. That's what they've evolved to do. However, if you want to insulate your hive, you can go ahead, and there's different theories on whether you should or shouldn't. Making sure they have enough food stores to last the winter is the primary thing to do. So you want to make sure that you feed your bees prior to winter if they don't have much honey stored. In the colder climates, you want a full box of honey for them to survive the winter. And in some cases, beekeepers will recommend in the extremely cold areas 2 boxes of honey for your bees to survive the winter. So if they don't have the stores prior to winter, you can start feeding sugar syrup for them to put away in the cells and store. You certainly don't want bees to starve. If you don't have to feed, it's better, but feeding's better than starving bees. Lots of brood on this. I like it when it's like clockwork across the comb. If I brush these away, you see there's plenty of brood in there. When they all hatch out, thousands of new bees in the hive. That's what we want to see. That's when we know the bees are gearing up to really harvest a good nectar flow as it comes. So what we might do today is take out one of the frames on the edge of the hive that are only honey and replace it with a brand new one. In that way, what we're doing is cycling out the old wax and replacing it with a new. Good thing to do from time to time, and also gives you some honeycomb to play with and for your friends at your next party to marvel at. So what I'm going to do is make a bit of space and pull out this very edge frame here. Now I might just
Clay would
leave
like
it
to
this
know,
way. Yep.
so should we open up the flow hive in the winter to let them get to the honey flow super?
Should we open up the hive
In the winter to let them get to the honey flow super?
Not sure I quite understand that question. Generally the bees have access to your honey flow super. There's an excluder in place here, and the bees can freely walk up into the super and eat that honey if they need to. but you may need to move that queen excluder during the winter. If you've got a long cold winter and the bees all move up into the super, then come spring again, you'll need to make sure the queen's down below to start laying in the brood box rather than in your flow frames. So that's the only caveat with leaving the flow frames on during the winter, is you'll need to make sure you get all the bees out of the way before you actually before they start laying in your flow frames. So if you have a look at this, this is all honey. There is no brood on this, and it is a reasonably dark old frame. They have attached some fresh wax here, or it's not quite fresh, but fresher than this dark stuff here. But what we might do is take the opportunity to remove this frame and replace with a new one, and that will just give some fresh space for the bees to get excited, draw some comb and start laying some more brood. If your bees are still hungry and they're not bringing any nectar, you wouldn't do that yet. You don't want to starve your bees. So because the queen could be on this frame, what we need to do is shake the bees off the frame. Now if you're shaking bees off a frame, then you need to do a short, sharp action where you shake the bees like this. So if the queen was on there, hopefully she just dropped right into your box, and most of the bees are now off this frame, which we can now put aside, and we'll end up taking that back into the kitchen. We can cut the wax out of it and put it back in the hive. So then what we're going to do is get a brand new one like this, or as said before, you can just chop out that wax onto a tray and that comb onto a tray and just put it straight back in, and it saves the mess. In this case I'm going to insert a brand new frame and take that away for processing and cleaning up. So the position where you might choose to put the new frame is in here, because we want it to be part of the brood nest rather than just another honey frame on the edge. You can see what's happening here. The bees are already going, wow, there's too much space between the frames, and they're building scaffolding. See that holding hands and feet across here? That's called festooning, where they actually start to build their own scaffolding. Maybe you can even see better if I put a little shadow there. You can see the scaffolding bridging across, and that's them starting to gear up to fill in that blank space with comb. They're so quick and so agile that they're really wanting to sort out this hive. Of course, I'm going to put a frame in there so they won't need to build a bridge across there. So I'll just keep moving that frame across using the hive tool, trying not to squash any bees between the end bars. I might choose to add a little bit of smoke. This time you probably need to add a bit more fuel to your smoker.
Shane would like to know, how often would you do a brood inspection in southeast Queensland?
So southeast Queensland, we don't need to do it as often as they do in other countries with the varroa mite. However, commercial beekeepers will routinely make sure they get through the brood nest of each hive a couple of times a year, and then on top of that, as needed, if they notice something amiss, like less bee numbers or not producing much honey, etc.
And Wesley asks, do you use your beeswax?
So I do sometimes. I will make a candle with the kids or something if I collect enough wax, or if we chew on that comb, we can put a little pot aside. It's a fun thing to do. Or you can make all sorts of lip balms and hair products and whatever from the beeswax. It's a beautiful natural substance. So I'm just dropping this new frame in to that position there, and I'm going to then put those other frames back.
Brian says, I see you have hive beetles. Is that a major concern?
It's not a major concern if your hive has plenty of bees. They will look after the hive and they will corral all the beetles. When it becomes a concern is when your hive's weak. Let's say they've lost their queen or they've swarmed and there's not enough bees to police all of the surface areas of comb in your hive. And that's when you can get in a situation where the beetles take advantage and actually take over, and your whole hive can turn into a hive beetle nest instead, which is quite annoying if that happens. Okay. So I'm just gently manoeuvring the frames around, respecting the order of honey on the edges and brood in the middle, and trying to put the frames back in such a way that they're in the same order, or if they're not in the same order, at least make sure the frames aren't being squashed together, because that's another place where hive beetles can take over. It's where you've squashed combs together and the bees actually can't service that area where the wax is all squashed together. And sometimes leaving the burr comb on, as Hilary Kearney says, can help you identify which order the frames need to go back in. And in this case I can see that these go side by side. And I'm just gently dropping that down. So that's it. We could choose to clean all of this up if we want. Again, you don't want to leave comb with honey in it outside the hive, or you'll promote robbing, which can spread pathogens. And then we're away. So beekeepers will often put 2 frames of spring management, 2 new frames in a hive in positions, say here and here, making sure there's plenty of space for the bees to draw new comb and start laying those eggs, and it will actually limit the swarming behaviour of a hive. In this case we're just going to put 1 in just to show you how to do that, and we're going to take 1 away. So thank you very much for watching, and best of luck with your honey season. If you're in the northern hemisphere, hopefully you're getting some beautiful nectar coming in and getting a late harvest. If you're in the southern hemisphere, then springtime is an exciting time and your bees will be building up. It's time to order your hives, order your bees, and get set up and enjoy the fascinating world of beekeeping. And it's such a beautiful thing to share not only the honey with the friends and family, but the harvesting experience and just the joy of having bees and the wonder of the extraordinary hive that they create and all of the things that they do and all of the things you learn along the way.